I learned that in my military experience that the buy-in was absolutely essential. If you're going to be in a life and death situation.
Welcome to the podcast about communication in business. I'm your host, George Torok. Did you know that I'm known as the speech coach for executives? That's because I help business leaders deliver the intended message for greater success. When you listen to this podcast, you will hear insights and perspectives from communication experts from around the world with very different backgrounds. My guest today is Robert W. Mixon. Here's 3 facts that I think you should know about Robert. 1, he served 33 years in the United States Army and led soldiers at every level from platoon to division. 2, he then spent 7 years in executive leadership positions in profit and not-for-profit companies before starting his own leadership company, Level 5 Associates, and that was 10 years ago. And 3, along his journey, he admits he's made just about all of the leadership mistakes you can make, and now his goal is to help others make less of them. Robert Mixon, welcome to Your Intended Message.
Thanks, George. It's a pleasure to be here and have a conversation with you about the essence of adaptive leadership and how effective communication underpins that adaptive leadership.
Perfect for us then. That's exactly what we're looking for. And I think it's revealing when you admit that you've made mistakes that you've learned from, and your goal is to help other people prevent them. And if only we could be more successful at that.
I agree, George. It's been a calling for me over a number of years now to give back. And one of the ways I wanted to be able to give back was to help people communicate in the way that they intended. So that's why I think the topic of your podcast, of Your Intended Message, fits so well with the pathway that I've been on in terms of trying to help people not make as many mistakes as I've made in leadership roles, whether it's small group or thousands of people. There's a lot of mistakes out there that we could all make, and we just need to be more aware of ourselves and those around us in order to be adaptive.
Good. Okay, then, and let's make sure that we reveal some of those mistakes. Now, I'm curious, your early experience was in the military, and 33 years of that is a strong grounding in military practices. And yet, when we think of military, or at least I do, and I've never been in the military, so my only exposure is through TV and movies. So when I think of military, I don't necessarily think of one of their strengths as communication skills. And tell me where I'm wrong.
Well, that's fair in some respects, George. In others, I think they do have a remarkable methodology for communicating. It's evolved over time, and over my journey, which was 33 years from the early 1970s until the early 2000s. I saw the military evolve and in its communication processes, and it became much less directive in some regards and more receptive. And I think I'll expand on that a little bit if it's all right with you. I grew up in a culture of compliance. The culture of compliance was do what you're told to do when you're told to do it. We're not going to talk about why. And if I'm in a good mood, I won't be very demeaning in my way of conveying the message. And it sounds a little bit like Gomer Pyle. Well, I don't think it was that absolute, but it was very specific and directive. Communication was considered to be a one-way street, and not necessarily a two-way street, which we know now that it absolutely is. Over time, the military evolved. I think the culture evolved to become more of a culture of commitment. And when I talk about the topic of my 2 books here, All In and The Power of Being All In, I learned that in my military experience that the buy-in was absolutely essential. If you're going to be in a life and death situation, in the generations that we represent, you've got to commit. And that's why communication had to be a two-way street in the military. And they learned that and began to practice that. And that evolution made a big impact on me.
And in the military, of course, there are times when it's critical that people do exactly what they're told, exactly when it's needed, because it's life and death. But there are other times when there's that room for, let's talk about this.
Yeah, and when we learned that, I think the military we became more, I don't know if mature is the right term, but we became more understanding of that, of the duality of those processes. There are times in the military when, as we say in the cavalry, I was privileged to be a cavalry officer, let's saddle up, let's ride. And we weren't going to debate it, discuss it, have a forum. We weren't going to do a sensing session. We weren't going to do a survey. We were going to saddle up and ride. And we did. There are other times when we were specifically expected to deliver several courses of action to a problem or a mission. In mission analysis, deliver thoughtful, reasonable courses of action, whereby commanders would give them the tools to decide. Now, you still have to decide in time, and perfect is the enemy of good enough. So we had to give them enough information as staff officers so that they could make an informed decision in time. But that reasoning process was an essential part of our communication skills in the military as well. So there are times you saddle up, and there are times you figure it out with courses of action.
Did the military encourage questioning of appropriate action? Were there times that was encouraged, that you need to think of a better way?
The primary time when we had those conversations, George, was in the course of action consideration. One of the fundamentals of the military was we didn't have a meeting after the meeting, which I found to be much more the case in the corporate world. We had a decision meeting, bringing in the courses of action, arguing the pros and cons, sometimes very heatedly. The best commanders would promote that type of conversation that was healthy, that we have the discussion and we disagree. But when the decision was made, when we went out the door, we were all in. We never discussed our differing opinions outside of the decision room or the meeting room, because it was considered disloyal. And it would undermine the commitment of the soldiers to the course of action that we had decided if we were going to have a meeting after the meeting. So that was a fundamental difference, but it gave us, as a military, a capability to be unified in our action. And as you can see in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, we conducted a classic battle of annihilation in military history as an allied force because we had that unity of effort, that unity of focus, that commitment.
When you left the military and went into the corporate world, what were your initial challenges to adapt your communication?
Well, I mean, the additional challenges to adapt my communication were to do a better job than I'd done before in listening with the intent to understand, as Stephen Covey says, and not listening with the intent to reply. I think that in the military, I had developed some bad habits, despite some of the positive evolutions I was talking about. One of those negative bad habits was I didn't always listen with the intent to understand. And I think I found in the corporate world that's not very common either, but it certainly was something I had to adopt and adapt over my journey. If I didn't listen with the intent to understand and help my leaders do that, then we had to, oftentimes redo processes and procedures over and over. In my first manufacturing company, one of the sayings I heard that I wasn't supposed to hear was that, we always have time, we never have time to do it right the first time, but we always have time to do it again, to redo it. And that was a very discouraging message for me to get, because what it meant was, we'll just go out there and do whatever it is that needs to be done with, to keep the boss happy, and then we'll just go back and redo it. And the fact that it costs us a lot of money between the top line and bottom line, so what? Well, there's a big so what there. And we went in the Great Depression of 2008, 2009, that big so what got even bigger. because every time you had a redo, you were taking more money out of your pocket and you were losing money, revenue and income already. So it was a tough lesson. But listening with the intent to understand was a very important part of my journey to transition from the military to the corporate world and bring some of the leadership tools that I had learned in the military into relevancy in the corporate environment, so that the intended message again that people heard what you think you said, and you heard what you think they said, and so I began to use a tool called the back brief, where we confirmed. In the military, called it confirmation brief, but you confirmed that what you think you heard someone say was what indeed they thought they said. That took a little extra time, but it certainly made develop more clarity. And I'd say one of the elements that wasn't prevalent as much in my corporate experience was you didn't have a lot of clarity unless you absolutely insisted on it or developed processes to sustain clarity. And so that was a very important lesson for me to learn.
Why do you think there initially was this lack of clarity? What in the environment created that?
I think there's, in many cases, a lack of discipline in communication. And everybody says, well, it's a military term. No, I don't think it is. Discipline is a rigor. It's a framework which you operate. And I don't think in my corporate experience there was a lot of rigor around the communication process. It was personality driven, or flavor of the month or spur of the moment. And as leaders, it was, I think, imperative that we impart some structure, some discipline to the communication process in order to get clarity. It just didn't come by osmosis. It was not there. And many leaders just felt like, oh, well, you must get it. You're on the team, or you've been in the company 5 years. Obviously you get it. And, we don't have to insist or confirm that you heard what, you think I said, and I heard what you think you said. Things like that.
And did you ever notice in the corporate world where leaders would expect that the team would adapt to their communication style?
Absolutely. That was far more prevalent than it should have been. If the boss was the boss, then everybody would adapt to the boss. But again, that didn't always make a healthy culture. I go back to the discussion of culture of compliance versus culture of commitment. The culture of compliance is a directive, transactional culture. And there were some military leaders and some corporate leaders that I encountered who were very strict believers in the culture of compliance. And they communicated that way. I think, George, there's a correlation. There's a correlation in communication shortfalls in the culture of compliance. There's a synergy in the positives in a culture of commitment. And by positives, I mean positive communication. What you heard is what you think was said, and vice versa. You can do that electronically, you can do it verbally, you can do it on face-to-face or on the phone or in a Zoom, but you have to go through a process, a discipline, a rigor as part of the way we do things. It has to be habitual. And that's one of the, I think, transformational elements of building a culture of commitment, is that structure, and the leaders insist on having that discipline in the communication process.
So Robert, I'm curious. Give us an example. Let's imagine that I work for you. We're in the corporate world, and you're giving me instructions, and you want to ensure that I understood what you said. Let's role play that. How would we go through that?
Well, let's talk about a production schedule in a manufacturing company, because that was one of my first challenges as president of a manufacturing company. So every day we'd have a production meeting in the morning. And that's where usually the first shift was the most robust if you had 2 or 3 shift manufacturing company, and we did have one of those. So we'd have a meeting early in the morning, 7:30, and that would be a production meeting, and we would publish the production schedule for the day. What raw product was coming in, what were we going to manufacture in terms of finished goods, and in what sequence would that go out the door. And it was put up with a flow chart and a spreadsheet, and most of the managers were in the room. And normally the president of the company or the general manager would conduct the presentation on those product flow. And then he or she would say, well, okay, everybody got it? And of course, what's the answer? Oh,
Of
yeah.
course. Yes,
Oh,
sir.
yeah.
Yes, sir.
It'd be like the Mixon nod. They'd all, nod up and down. Yeah, okay, we got that. And then they go out and do something, reasonably, approximately what was supposed to be done, or sometimes like really different than what was supposed to be done. And then you go out there and have to redo it, and go out there and correct it, and go out there and fix it. Well, since you didn't confirm that they heard what you said or showed them that you thought was going to be done, then they did selective interpretation of what they thought you said, and they would adjust as they saw fit, and then you'd have to go back and fix it. And I can't tell you how many times we had to go back to redos, or go back to the wrong product, was in the wrong sequence, went to the wrong door, went to the wrong customer. Those errors in flow were unnecessary, but they were caused by the fact that our intended message didn't get through. My intended message didn't get through. We didn't confirm it. And it not only happened one day, it happened almost every day. And I just couldn't reconcile myself easily to why this was so, except finally it dawned on me that this was the way things had always been done. And as you and I both know, when you get into a fixed way of thinking and doing, it's very difficult to undo it. Change is hard even when you violently agree with it. But that's an example of what I lived with in my first manufacturing company. And then, of course, in my second one, too, because that was the way they had done things, too. And you've got to nudge people into a new way of thinking, of listening with the intent to understand, of confirming what they heard they thought you said, or you heard what they said. And then taking that extra time before you launch out the door and start, bringing goods and services to the customer. You have clarity, as we talked about earlier, right? You have clarity. That's well worth the investment of time to create that clarity.
The leader doesn't check with the people to see if they understood it the way the leader intended, and the people don't question the instructions. I'm wondering, is that because they're both afraid of something?
There's some fear there, sure. And I mentioned change. I think there's also fear of, there are several factors at work in most of us in how we interact. No one wants to look ignorant. They don't want to look incompetent. They don't want to look, I guess you would say, irresponsible. So they act accordingly so that they don't look that way. They're not perceived that way. And so we interact with each other in ways that are defensive sometimes. Who wants to be vulnerable? Most leaders will tell you that that's one of the things they would resist vigorously is being vulnerable, and yet that's one of the strongest elements of authenticity. As the finest leaders I've ever known, generals like General Colin Powell. I had the privilege of being his executive assistant. I think I shared that with you, George. But what a remarkable level 5 individual, because he could be vulnerable, but he was still very much the leader in charge who we wanted to be with, who developed and nurtured a culture of commitment. But he had weaknesses. We all have weaknesses. He was simply willing to admit sometimes that he'd made a mistake, or that there was another way to do this, or that we needed to adjust, we needed to adapt. Again, he was the essence of the adaptive leader.
Adaptive leader. I've seen you use that term. Does that mean that a person needs to be changing every day?
No, I don't think so. I think it's a learned skill, first of all, George. It's a learned skill, and I use my Big Six principles as the foundational beliefs that adaptive leaders adopt. And the Big Six principles, are very simply stated, are set your azimuth, your cardinal direction as a person in an organization. Listen with the intent to understand. Trust and empower others. Do the right thing when no one's looking. When in charge, take charge. Not in a profane, offensive, abusive way, but being the calm in the chaos. Like, we live in a world of chaos. And the sixth principle is balance, the personal and professional. And balance in terms of 4 levels of energy, not time. First, you can't manage time. Time is finite. But you have 4 levels of energy that you can nurture: physical, emotional, spiritual, and mental. Those are the ingredients that create balance in yourself and in others. If you take these 6 principles and you adapt the principles into the behaviors that you foster in your organization, then you will build world-class cultures, cultures of commitment. And the process works. And I tell you it works because I've seen it, and I've also screwed it up. I've screwed all 6 of them up, and I've seen what doesn't work. And the good news is I was nurtured and educated by people like General Powell, who helped me learn. One of my favorite scenarios about learning, George, is a problem comes up, say on the production line, and the general manager rolls out the floor and says, "So Robert, what were you thinking?" The best leaders I've ever known would say, "So Robert, what did we learn here?" Those are 2 entirely different questions. They elicit entirely different responses. And if we're going to talk about sending a message and receiving a message, right, George, then do we want to do that? Do we want to do it positively or negatively? Do we want it to be clearly understood or partially understood? And that's where I think adaptive leadership, using the big 6 principles, builds the foundation for a culture of excellence. You build it and then you nurture it, and it works.
Do you find when you're working with leaders now, when you're advising and coaching leaders, do you find that they are most receptive after they've made a mistake?
I would say not specifically. I mean that by saying some leaders are inherently defensive because they think they know what right looks like. That's how they got to be leaders, or they own the company and therefore they know what right looks like. They're the CEO. You have to break down some barriers and build some trust before leaders are willing to be vulnerable. As I mentioned earlier, George, vulnerability is a great strength, but it's not one that many leaders want to manifest because they see it as weakness, it is not. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's authenticity. If you learn from it, if you adapt to it, adapt to what you learn, it's not a weakness at all.
In one of your recent articles, you used the term polarization.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us what that means.
Polarization is a trend that has been underway in our society now for a number of years. And the power of being all in, I talk about what's happened to us in the past 6 years. The chaos that's been created as polarization was an outcome. The pandemic, the increase in global warfare, really, if you look at the attack on Ukraine and elsewhere. The social upheaval that caused riots and chaos in our country. The rise of gun violence that's tragic and still occurring as we speak. We have a host of factors that are driving us apart. Polarization is encampment. It's the encampment of ideas where people set up camp and never the two shall meet. There's no white flag negotiators and things like that, which we used to have in the days of ancient warfare. You simply are taking sides and keeping those sides. And it breaks down. It breaks down the framework of communication. And you end up then with only misinformation and propaganda and one-way transmission of ideas. Not listening with intent to understand. Simply transmitting ideas, many of them vitriolic, and certainly create more polarization. The encampments become more distinctive, and the trench lines become deeper. And that's what I worry about. In the recent article, I talked about how polarization is a barrier that we have to overcome. If we're going to reconcile who we are and what we represent, and the essence of what's made this society and our nation so great, we've got to break down some of the polarization barriers that we've created over the past 5 or 6 years.
Barriers are typically raised to protect us. What do you think these barriers are protecting us from now?
I think now they're protecting us from learning. They're protecting us from collaborating. They're protecting us from conveying our ideas in a way that each other can understand. It's not. It's only protecting us from growth, and I think that's a very negative trend. We've got to figure out how to break down some of the barriers that may have been designed to protect us, but what they're doing is they're harming us. They're hurting us.
When you're working with business leaders, executives, do you ever get pushback from them when they say, well, Robert, maybe that worked in the military, but here in the real world, do you get that kind of talk?
Yeah. Well, George, I would ask you. You've heard that, right? Yeah. I mean, you've heard it in your conversations and podcasts. It's there are biases. We all have biases, and part of the bias that I have to work through is that the veteran population in the United States is less than 4% of the adults in America. So, my neighborhood when I was a kid growing up, every single person on my street, was a veteran in terms of the parent figure in the household. Nowadays in the military, it's probably 4% is what. It's a very small number if you go down the street and look for how many veterans are living on the street. So we've got a communication shortfall just because we have a problem of ignorance, and that many Americans don't know what it's like to be a veteran. They don't live around them. They don't go to school with them. And sometimes it can exacerbate some biases if all you ever get out of or understand about the military is what you've seen on TV, or you've watched in the movies or read in a book. Then your biases are going to be pretty pronounced. And I think we have to break down some of those barriers too, in terms of communication flow. And so we can do a better job at that. Well, I think one of my charters in my journey has been to help bridge some of the gaps of ignorance with my colleagues, in terms of who are we as veterans, and what can we contribute to the success of your organization. And I believe we can contribute mightily to the success of a business, regardless of service or manufacturing or for-profit or not-for-profit. It's just a question of assimilation. We need to work together to be assimilated into the team. And of course, what helps do that most of all? Communication, right? The understanding of communication, of conveying the message that we all understand, and learning from each other. And that will help reduce some of the biases. Not going to eliminate them, George, but I think it will reduce them significantly.
What has, other than what you've mentioned already, what has been some of the most productive communication lessons for you?
I would say there are three lessons, George, that I'd ask we can take away from this conversation, the listeners here in our audience. The first one is that communication has to be deliberate, and you as a leader have to bring it every day. I would recommend that leaders conduct a daily audit of themselves for about 10 minutes. Audit yourself as a communicator and say, how well did I send and receive information today, and confirm it was sent and received. The second lesson I would say in communication is use the 2-second rule when you're speaking with another individual. And the 2-second rule basically says, I will wait 2 seconds before I respond to anyone who speaks with me. I don't recommend counting out loud, George. That's a rule. But the 2 seconds will give you a lot of room to ponder and consider what was said, and someone may have more to say. And I think it also indicates respect. When you don't interrupt someone, you indicate respect. When you do interrupt, you indicate a lack of that. The third communication skill I think that we could take away here is that sometimes it's more effective and important to consider what someone else says than to deliver what you think you need to say. And I may have said that in a little bit of a complex way. But the intent here is that if you go into a conversation looking for empathetic communication, looking to help understand what makes her tick, what makes them tick, and not just let me deliver my wisdom and hopefully they'll get it, then I think you'll change your perspective. you'll have more time or more room to consider how does everyone win? What's in it for all of us? And that would solve a lot of differences of opinion and I think misunderstandings along the way. So those 3 tools I think you could employ, put in your leader toolkit as an adaptive leader, and start using them today.
3 powerful pieces of advice. Robert, for those who would like to know more about your book, it's called The Power of Being All In, Why Today's Transformative Times Demand Transformative Leadership. They can find that at Amazon, and we have that link in the description below. As well as that, people can have a look at your website, which is level5associates.com. And you have articles published on your Substack.
Yeah, our Substack platform is https://robertmixon.substack.com. And you can subscribe for free. On my website, you can download Chapter 1 of The Power of Being All In and my earlier book, We're All In, about culture, and you can download them for free. So I'd encourage you to do that. Go to the website, download those 2 chapters, go to my Substack platform and subscribe, and be part of the conversation. We have an active dialogue about adaptive leadership and about the power of effective communication. And I think, in the world we both live in sending an intended message and receiving it, it's a win-win. It's a win-win for us as leaders to develop cultures of commitment where people belong.
That is powerful advice. Folks, play that last bit back again. Listen again, because there's powerful advice. My guest today is Robert Mixon, reminding you, and remember those 3 points he made. 1, be deliberate. 2, use the 2-second rule. And 3, be considerate. If you like what you heard, remember to like, comment, and share this podcast. Come back every week for more practical insights to help you deliver your intended message. I'm your host, George Torok.